The morning of January 17th, 1945, Binalonan, Luzon. Warrant Officer Kojura Wada crouched inside his Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha medium tank, concealed beneath the canopy of a mango grove just off the main road. Through his vision slit, he watched 3 American Sherman tanks approaching through the palm trees. 30 meters. The white stars painted on their hulls were clearly visible now. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His gunner's hand hovered over the firing lever of their 47mm gun, but Wada didn't give the order. Not yet. Because 6 months of training in Manchuria, 3 years of service in China, and every doctrine manual issued by Imperial General Headquarters had taught him one fundamental principle. The Type 97 could defeat any tank the Americans fielded. The 47mm high-velocity gun, mounted in his new turret, had proven itself against Soviet armor at Khalkhin Gol. Japanese engineers had assured them it could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at 500 meters. The technical specifications were clear. The combat reports were confident. The propaganda was absolute. In less than 60 seconds, Kojura Wada would discover that everything he'd been told was a lie. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the documented story of the largest tank battle in the Pacific Theater, the collision between Japan's 2nd Tank Division and American armored forces on the central plains of Luzon, where 220 Japanese tanks faced 76 American Shermans and Stuarts, where Japanese tankers, trained to believe their equipment was superior, confronted the overwhelming material reality of American firepower, where the technical specifications carefully recorded in maintenance manuals met the brutal physics of armor-piercing rounds, traveling at 2,600 feet per second. This is not a story of cowardice or incompetence. It is a story of men betrayed by their own military-industrial complex, of soldiers who fought with extraordinary courage in vehicles that were obsolete before they left the factory, of the moment when Japanese tank doctrine, built on victories against Chinese forces equipped with light tanks and outdated anti-tank weapons, shattered against the industrial might of the United States. To understand what happened on the killing fields around Binalonan, San Manuel and Urdaneta in January and February of 1945, we must first understand what Japanese tankers believed about their equipment and why those beliefs were so catastrophically wrong. In the summer of 1944, the Japanese 2nd Tank Division, code-named Geki Force, meaning attack, was transferred from its garrison duty along the Soviet border in Manchuria to the Philippines. Under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshiharu Iwanaka, it represented the largest concentration of Japanese armor ever deployed in the Pacific War. Approximately 11,200 men, 1,500 vehicles, and at its core, 220 tanks, 175 Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha medium tanks, 25 Type 89 Igo medium tanks, 20 Type 95 Hago light tanks. This was not a desperate last-ditch force scraped together from training units and obsolete equipment. This was a frontline armored division, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, equipped with the best tanks Japan had produced for combat service. The men of Geki Force had reason for confidence. Many were veterans of the China campaigns, where Japanese armor had performed brilliantly against Chinese nationalist forces. The Type 97 Chi-Ha, first deployed in 1938, had proven itself in dozens of engagements. Its 57mm gun could destroy Chinese pillboxes. Its diesel engine, a rarity in World War II tank design, provided excellent range and reduced fire risk. Its low profile made it difficult to spot in jungle terrain. During the Malayan campaign of 1941 and 42, Type 97 tanks had spearheaded General Yamashita's lightning conquest of Singapore. British defenders, expecting the jungle terrain to be impassable for armor, were shocked when Japanese tanks appeared where they were thought impossible. The 3rd Tank Company under 1st Lieutenant Yamane distinguished itself, breaking through British defensive lines and contributing directly to the fall of Singapore. These victories weren't accidents. They were the result of sound Japanese armor doctrine applied against enemies who lacked effective anti-tank capabilities. But there was a problem. A fundamental disconnect between Japanese tank development and the reality of modern armored warfare. Japan's tank doctrine had been forged in the crucible of the Second Sino-Japanese War and the border conflicts with the Soviet Union in the late 1930s. Against Chinese forces, who fielded only 3 tank battalions consisting of British Vickers exports, German Panzer Is, and Italian CV-33 tankettes, the Type 97 was more than adequate. Its 57mm gun was designed primarily for infantry support, not tank versus tank combat, because in China there were virtually no enemy tanks to fight. The wake-up call came in July of 1939. The battles of Khalkhin Gol, where Japanese forces clashed with the Soviet Red Army along the Mongolian-Manchurian border. Soviet tanks, equipped with high-velocity 45mm and 76.2mm guns, outranged and outgunned the Type 97. The command tank of the 3rd Tank Regiment of the Japanese Army's Yasuoka detachment received a single hit from a Soviet gun and was destroyed. Shots fired from other Type 97 Chi-Ha tanks were unable to penetrate the armor of Soviet tanks. The Type 97's 57mm infantry support gun, firing at low velocity, proved completely inadequate against modern armor. Japanese military observers recognized the problem immediately. Reports filed after Khalkhin Gol prompted an urgent upgunning program. By 1941, engineers at Osaka Arsenal had developed the Type 1 47mm tank gun, a high-velocity weapon with significantly better armor penetration than the original 57mm gun. The new gun required turret modifications. The result was the Type 97 Kai, or improved, also known as the Shinhoto Chi-Ha, the new turret Chi-Ha. The redesigned turret was larger, with faceted angles and a thick gun mantlet. Maximum armor thickness increased from 28mm to 33mm on the mantlet. The new 47mm gun had a muzzle velocity of 823 meters per second and could penetrate 65mm of armor at 500 meters. This was the tank that equipped the bulk of Geki force in 1944, and by the standards of Japanese tank design, it represented a genuine improvement. The 47mm gun was effective against the American M3 Stuart light tank. It could penetrate the sides and rear of the M4 Sherman medium tank if it could get close enough and maneuver for a flank shot. Japanese tank commanders were told their improved Chi-Ha could engage the Sherman on relatively equal terms. The training manuals distributed to crews emphasized the importance of camouflage, ambush tactics, and aiming for weak points in the Sherman's armor. But those manuals contained a fatal omission. They didn't account for the Sherman's main advantage, which wasn't its armor or its speed, it was its gun. The M4 Sherman medium tank that American forces deployed to the Philippines in 1944 came in several variants. The most common was the M4A3, armed with the 75mm M3 gun. This was a medium-velocity weapon, similar in concept to the German 75mm guns mounted on the Panzer IV. It fired a 17-pound armor-piercing shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet per second. At 500 yards, it could penetrate 86 millimeters of armor. At 1,000 yards, 67 millimeters. But some Sherman units in the Philippines were equipped with an even more powerful weapon, the 76mm Moni gun. This was a high-velocity weapon, developed specifically to counter the heavy German tanks encountered in Europe. Using standard M62 armor-piercing capped ammunition, it could penetrate 109 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. And if the crew had access to the new M93 HVAP high-velocity armor-piercing rounds with their tungsten carbide cores, penetration increased to 178 millimeters at 1,000 meters. Let's pause for a moment to understand what these numbers mean in practical terms. The Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha had maximum armor thickness of 33mm on the gun mantlet. The frontal hull armor was 25mm, the turret face 25mm, the sides 20mm, the rear 20mm. A Sherman's 75mm gun, firing standard armor-piercing ammunition, could penetrate 86mm at 500 yards. The Chi-Ha's maximum armor thickness was 33mm. The Sherman's penetration capability was 2.6 times greater than the Chi-Ha's thickest armor. At point-blank range, the disparity only increased with distance. A Sherman could penetrate the Chi-Ha's frontal armor at over 1,500 yards, well beyond the effective range of the Chi-Ha's own gun. A Sherman with a 76mm gun could penetrate the Chi-Ha from virtually any angle, at virtually any combat range. But Japanese tankers didn't know this. Or, more accurately, they knew the specifications of their own tanks. They knew the specifications that had been provided for American tanks, specifications that were incomplete, outdated, or deliberately optimistic. They knew what they'd been told, that with proper tactics, courage, and the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit, they could defeat the Sherman. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know until they experienced it, was what it felt like when an armor-piercing round travelling at 2,600 feet per second struck thin, riveted steel plate. The sound, not the Hollywood explosion, the real sound, a metallic shriek as the projectile pierced the armor. Then, the secondary effects. Spalling fragments of the inner armor face, blown inward by the impact, ricocheting through the crew compartment at lethal velocities. The overpressure wave. The instant transformation of a 14-ton tank into a metal coffin. Japanese tank crews learned these realities in the worst possible way. Not in training exercises with test firings against captured equipment, not in technical briefings with detailed ballistic tables, but in combat, in the villages and rice paddies of central Luzon, where American tanks, often alerted by Filipino scouts, lay in wait with clear fields of fire. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of the Japanese 14th Area Army defending the Philippines, understood the hopelessness of his situation. American intelligence estimated he had tanks, they had tanks, but more importantly, they had air superiority, artillery superiority, and logistics. Yamashita's strategy wasn't to win, it was to delay, to tie down American forces in the Philippines for as long as possible, keeping them away from the Japanese home islands, buying time for the defense of the homeland. So he made a fateful decision regarding Geki Force. Rather than risk his armor in large-scale counterattacks against superior American forces, he ordered the 2nd Tank Division to withdraw to defensive positions in the north. The tanks would be used strategically, not squandered in futile charges. They would defend key choke points, particularly around the provincial capital of San Jose, which protected the entrance to Balete Pass, the route to Yamashita's headquarters near Baguio in the mountains. But holding those positions required something that contradicted every principle of mobile armored warfare. It required turning tanks into pillboxes, digging them into the earth, camouflaging them in groves and buildings, waiting for American infantry and armor to come within the limited effective range of the 47mm gun. This wasn't mobile warfare. This wasn't the lightning thrusts that had conquered Malaya. This was desperation tactics, masquerading as strategy. And it meant that when Japanese tanks finally engaged American Shermans in the largest armor battles of the Pacific War, they did so under the worst possible circumstances. Outnumbered, outgunned, operating from static positions that negated their mobility, with dwindling fuel supplies that made maneuver warfare impossible even if it had been attempted, against an enemy who had spent 3 years perfecting the combined arms tactics that had crushed German armor in Normandy. The mathematics of desperation were written not in battle plans but in physics, in the kinetic energy of projectiles, in the molecular structure of armor plate, in the industrial capacity that allowed America to produce 50,000 Sherman tanks while Japan produced fewer than 3,000 tanks of all types during the entire war. But those mathematics remained theoretical until the morning of January 9th, 1945, when the first American forces came ashore at Lingayen Gulf, and the long-awaited collision between Japanese armor doctrine and American material superiority began. The American landing at Lingayen Gulf on January 9th, 1945, proceeded with surprising ease. The first waves of infantry from Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's Sixth Army quickly overran the beachheads, surging inland with minimal resistance. But as these assault echelons pushed deeper into the interior, Major General Innis P. Swift and his I Corps commanders grew increasingly concerned. Somewhere out there, hidden in the villages and valleys of central Luzon, was the Japanese 2nd Tank Division, 11,000 men, 220 tanks. The Americans had never faced such a large concentration of Japanese armor. The threat of this potent force appearing suddenly, crashing into American supply lines or enveloping advancing infantry units, haunted Swift's planning sessions. Aerial reconnaissance flights furnished few clues. The Type 97 tanks, with their low profiles and excellent camouflage discipline, were nearly impossible to spot from the air when properly concealed. Reports from Filipino civilians often proved unreliable, some out of genuine confusion, others because Japanese troops threatened villages that cooperated with the Americans. For several days, the mystery deepened. Where was Geki Force? American intelligence officers studied maps, analyzed road networks, and tried to predict where Yamashita would commit his armor. Then, on January 11th, patrols from the 43rd Infantry Division discovered the answer. The Japanese main defensive belt was centered on a line running roughly north to south through several key towns, Rosario, Pozorubio, Binalonan, and behind that line, dug into positions around San Jose, San Manuel, Lupao, and Muñoz, waited the tanks of the 2nd Tank Division. They weren't massed for a dramatic counterattack. They were dispersed into company-sized detachments, each supporting a strongpoint defense. This was Yamashita's strategy made manifest. Trade space for time. Make the Americans fight for every town, every road junction, every rice paddy. Use the tanks not as instruments of mobile warfare, but as mobile pillboxes, capable of devastating any American unit that came within range. The first contact came on the night of January 14th, near a small settlement called Malasin. 3 Japanese Type 95 Hago light tanks, smaller and even more lightly armored than the Chi-Ha, mounting only 37mm guns, blundered into a roadblock set up by Company A, 103rd Infantry Regiment, 43rd Infantry Division. American infantrymen, their hearts pounding as they heard the distinctive rattle of tank treads approaching in the darkness, crouched behind their defensive positions. The lead Hago rounded a corner. A bazooka team, positioned at the corner of a building, fired. The 2.36-inch rocket, trailing fire and smoke, covered the 30 yards to the target in less than a second. It struck the Hago on its thin side armor, only 12mm thick, and detonated. The shaped charge jet burned through the armor like a blowtorch through paper. The tank shuddered to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. The other 2 Hagos, their commanders suddenly aware they'd driven into an ambush, immediately reversed course and disappeared into the night. This brief firefight marked the first blood drawn between Geki Force and I Corps. 1 Japanese light tank destroyed, no American casualties. But it was merely the appetizer. The real meal came 2 nights later. On January 16th, 1st Lieutenant Yoshitaka Takaki received orders to lead a combined armor infantry raid from the Japanese base at Binalonan. His force consisted of tanks from the 7th Tank Regiment, including his own Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha, and infantry from the 2nd Mobile Infantry Regiment. The objective: disrupt American preparations for their assault on the main defensive line. Takaki's force moved out after nightfall, when American air superiority meant nothing. They got as far as Pot Pot, a tiny hamlet defended by the same Company A, 103rd Infantry that had destroyed the Hago at Malasin. The Americans were ready. This time, the fighting was more intense. Japanese tanks and infantry pressed the attack, machine guns chattering, trying to overrun the American position through speed and aggression. But the Americans had more than bazookas now. They had 50-caliber machine guns, which, at close range, could penetrate the vision slits and thin roof armor of Japanese tanks. They had rifle grenades, and they had artillery on call. The raid was repulsed. Several Japanese soldiers were killed. Takaki's tanks withdrew, damaged but still operational. But the American defenders had learned something crucial. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese tanks, when forced to attack prepared positions, were vulnerable, very vulnerable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By January 17th, American forces were ready to assault Binalonan itself. The town was a critical objective, a crossroads controlling access to the interior. Intelligence reports indicated it was defended by elements of the 7th Tank Regiment and supporting infantry. The assault began with artillery preparation. American 105mm and 155mm howitzers pounded the town, turning wooden buildings into kindling, sending up columns of smoke visible for miles. Then the infantry moved in, supported by tanks from the 716th Tank Battalion. And that's where Warrant Officer Kojura Wada was waiting, concealed in his mango grove, watching 3 American Shermans approach. Let's return to that moment. Wada's Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha was one of 3 tanks, positioned in ambush. The tactical situation seemed ideal. His tanks were camouflaged, invisible to the approaching Americans. The range was closing to 30 meters point blank, where even the 47mm gun could penetrate Sherman armor if aimed at the right spots. The Americans, advancing cautiously but without apparent awareness of the threat, were perfect targets. Every instinct, every hour of training, told Wada to wait just a few more seconds. Let them get closer, 20 meters, 10 meters. Then open fire simultaneously with all 3 tanks, destroying the American force before they could react. It was the textbook ambush. It was what Wada had been trained to do. He waited. 30 meters, 25 meters. The lead Sherman was so close now that Wada could see details through his vision slit. The welded hull, the white star, even the antenna whipping back and forth as the tank moved. And then something unexpected happened. The Sherman stopped. The turret began to traverse, slowly, deliberately, turning toward the mango grove, toward Wada's position. Later, Wada would realize what had happened. A Filipino scout, watching from a concealed position, had spotted the Japanese tanks despite their camouflage. He'd signaled the Americans, or perhaps the Sherman commander, experienced from fighting in the Pacific Islands, had simply developed an instinct for danger, had noticed something wrong about the grove, the shadows, the unnatural pattern of the foliage. Whatever the reason, the Americans knew. The ambush was compromised, and in the next 30 seconds, everything changed. The Sherman's 75mm gun fired. At 25 meters, there was no need to aim carefully. The tank was enormous in the gunner's sight. The armor-piercing round, weighing 17 pounds and travelling at 2,000 feet per second, crossed the distance in a fraction of a second. It struck Wada's Chi-Ha on the frontal hull, the 25mm armor plate that was supposed to protect the crew compartment. The round didn't bounce, didn't deflect, didn't slow. It punched through the armor like it wasn't there. The inside of the tank became a storm of metal. The primary penetration hole, roughly 3 inches in diameter, was bad enough, but the secondary effects were worse. Spalling. Fragments of the inner armor face, blown backward by the impact, turned into shrapnel travelling at hundreds of feet per second. One fragment caught Wada's loader in the chest, killing him instantly. Another fragment disabled the radio. The tank's diesel engine, hit by debris, began to seize. Smoke filled the crew compartment. Wada, trained to remain calm under fire, tried to assess the damage, but his gunner was screaming. Not in pain, he wasn't wounded. In shock. Because for all their training, for all the technical briefings and gunnery exercises, nothing had prepared them for the reality of being on the receiving end of American firepower. The other two Japanese tanks in the ambush position opened fire. Both scored hits on American Shermans. But there's a critical difference between hitting and penetrating. The 47mm rounds struck Sherman armor and bounced. The Americans had unknowingly positioned themselves at angles that maximized their armor's effective thickness. The sloped frontal hull of the Sherman, combined with the angle of engagement, meant the Japanese rounds were hitting armor with an effective thickness exceeding 100 millimeters. The 47mm gun, even at point-blank range, could not penetrate. The sound inside the Sherman, a sharp, metallic clang as the round ricocheted away, was loud and alarming. But the crew was unharmed, the tank was unharmed, and now they knew exactly where the Japanese tanks were hiding. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. The three American Shermans, working with practiced coordination, maneuvered for better firing positions, while continuing to engage. 2 more 75mm rounds slammed into the Japanese tanks. One penetrated the turret of the second Chi-Ha, the shaped round punching through the 25mm turret armor and detonating the 47mm ammunition stored inside. The turret didn't explode off the tank. That Hollywood image is largely myth, but the ammunition fire was catastrophic. The crew had perhaps 5 seconds to evacuate before the flames reached the diesel fuel tank. Only the driver escaped. The third Japanese tank, its commander seeing 2 of his platoon destroyed in less than 90 seconds, made the only sensible decision. He reversed out of the grove, using smoke from his burning companions as cover, and fled toward the center of Binalonan. But fleeing didn't mean survival. American infantry, advancing behind the Shermans, now knew where the Japanese defensive line was. Artillery was called in, more Shermans arrived, and the systematic reduction of Binalonan began. By 1300 hours on January 18th, the 161st Infantry Regiment, supported by 3 medium tanks from the 716th Tank Battalion, had completely cleared Binalonan. The butcher's bill told the story. Japanese casualties, approximately 250 killed, 9 tanks destroyed or captured, 2 75mm artillery weapons, 5 trucks, large quantities of ammunition. American casualties, 19 men killed, 66 wounded, 3 trucks destroyed. The disparity was stark. But Binalonan was just the beginning. 6 miles to the south, in the town of San Manuel, waited a much larger Japanese force. Captain Hiroshi Shigemi's detachment consisted of over 1,000 men, including rifle elements from the understrength 1st Battalion, 2nd Mobile Infantry, and the armoured strength of the 7th Tank Regiment, 40 Type 97 medium tanks and 5 Type 95 light tanks, 15 75mm and 105mm artillery pieces, multiple 47mm anti-tank guns, at least 25 machine guns, 15 or more light mortars. This wasn't an outpost. This was a fortress. The terrain around San Manuel favoured the defenders. The town sat at the base of a bare ridge that provided excellent observation. Drainage ditches, some deep and broad, ringed the southern and western approaches. Dense bamboo thickets, interspersed with large trees, grew along the outskirts. The Japanese had spent days preparing their positions. Tanks were dug into revetments, with only their turrets exposed. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover every approach. Machine gun nests were concealed in buildings and tree lines. Artillery pieces were registered on likely American assembly areas. Shigemi's orders were clear. Hold San Manuel at all costs. Deny the Americans this critical road junction, and he had the forces to do it, or so it seemed, because the Japanese defensive plan had a fatal flaw. It assumed that American firepower would be limited to direct fire weapons, tanks, and anti-tank guns engaging targets they could see. It assumed that American artillery would be relatively ineffective against dispersed, dug-in targets. It assumed, in short, that the Americans would fight the kind of battle Japanese doctrine anticipated. They didn't. Starting on January 19th, American forces began a systematic reduction of San Manuel that would last for 9 days. The 161st Infantry Regiment, supported by Company C of the 716th Tank Battalion, Company D of the 98th Chemical Battalion with its 4.2-inch mortars, and multiple battalions of artillery, surrounded the town. But they didn't rush in. Instead, they did what American forces had learned to do in the Pacific. They applied overwhelming firepower. For 5 solid days, San Manuel was pounded. 100 and 5mm howitzers. 155mm howitzers, 8-inch guns firing from positions miles away. Naval aviation dropping bombs. Light bombers from the 5th Air Force. 4.2-inch mortar rounds, arcing down into the town at steep angles, penetrating overhead cover. The bombardment was methodical. Forward observers on the bare ridge north of town called in adjustments. Grid squares were systematically worked over. Japanese positions were pulverized, and the tanks, those 40 Type 97 Chi-Has that represented Japan's cutting-edge armor technology, were helpless. Dug into their revetments, they couldn't maneuver, couldn't relocate, couldn't do anything but endure the bombardment. Some took direct hits and were destroyed outright. Others suffered near misses that damaged their tracks or optics. Still others remained physically intact but had their crews killed or wounded by shell fragments. The diesel engines, once considered an advantage because they were less prone to fire, became a disadvantage because they required external air intakes that could be damaged by overpressure. On January 24th, after 5 days of bombardment that transformed San Manuel from a functioning town into a moonscape of craters and rubble, the American infantry attacked. The 2nd Battalion, 161st Infantry Regiment, made the main effort, striking from the north. The 1st Battalion moved in from the west and southwest, and this time they had learned from their earlier costly attempt. The tanks didn't lead, artillery led, infantry followed closely behind rolling barrages, and when Japanese positions revealed themselves by firing, American tank destroyers and Shermans engaged them from positions of advantage. The fighting was brutal, house to house, room to room. Japanese infantry, fighting with the desperate courage of men who knew no quarter would be given or asked, defended every building. The remaining, operational Chi-Ha tanks, unable to maneuver in the narrow streets choked with rubble, fired from static positions until American bazookas or tank destroyers found them. Technical Sergeant Donald E. Rudolph became a one-man wrecking crew that day, advancing down a line of 8 pillboxes and tossing hand grenades through their firing slits. Then, in an act of almost suicidal courage, he climbed aboard a Japanese tank that was firing on his troops and dropped a white phosphorus grenade down the turret hatch. The tank's crew had perhaps 3 seconds to realize what was happening before the grenade detonated. White phosphorus burns at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit and cannot be extinguished with water. The crew that managed to escape the tank were on fire. Those who didn't escape died of burns or asphyxiation. Rudolph received the Medal of Honor and a battlefield promotion to 2nd lieutenant. By January 26th, San Manuel was largely in American hands, but Captain Shigemi's remaining forces, now compressed into a shrinking perimeter, continued to resist. On the morning of January 28th, around 0100 hours, Shigemi made his final decision. He would break out. 13 Type 97 tanks remained operational out of the original 40. These would lead. Infantry would follow closely, using the tanks as mobile cover. The objective was simple: escape to the north, regroup with other Japanese forces, and continue the fight. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all Shigemi had left. The breakout began in the pre-dawn darkness. The 13 Chi-Ha tanks roared to life, their diesel engines shattering the silence. They assaulted in waves of 3. Each tank followed closely by foot soldiers. The 161st Infantry's regimental history recorded what happened next with clinical precision. The tanks assaulted in waves of 3. Each tank followed closely by foot troops. Riflemen in pits opposed them with rifle, anti-tank grenades, bazookas, and caliber 50 machine guns. Company A's tanks were quickly alerted and moved into position. Tank destroyers were brought forward. Artillery was called in. What the regimental history didn't fully capture was the sound, the cacophony, diesel engines roaring, track plates clanking on pavement, the crack of 47mm guns, the deeper boom of 75mm Sherman guns, the whoosh of bazookas, the staccato hammering of 50 caliber machine guns, the screams of wounded men, and above it all, the whistling descent of artillery shells called in by American forward observers who could see the Japanese tanks silhouetted against burning buildings. The first wave of 3 Chi-Ha tanks made it perhaps 200 yards before American fire converged on them. A bazooka round struck the lead tank's track, immobilizing it. The crew attempted to bail out. 2 made it. The gunner didn't. A 75mm round from a Sherman, firing from a hull-down position 300 yards away, penetrated the stationary tank's side armor. The other 2 tanks in the first wave tried to maneuver around their stricken leader. One made it another 50 yards before a tank destroyer's 76mm gun, the high-velocity weapon that American crews called the Long Tom, struck it squarely on the turret face. The penetration was catastrophic. The turret didn't blow off, but everyone inside died instantly from the combination of spalling, overpressure, and the armor piercing round itself, which ricocheted around the interior like a pinball from hell. The third tank of the first wave, seeing both companions destroyed, attempted to reverse course, but it was too late. American artillery pre-registered on likely Japanese routes began to fall. High explosive shells, fused to detonate above ground, sent shrapnel sleeting down. The tank itself might have survived, but the infantry following it exposed, in the open, were cut to pieces. The second wave fared no better, the third wave slightly worse. By 0200 hours, 1 hour after the breakout began, 11 of the 13 tanks were burning or abandoned. Approximately 300 Japanese soldiers were dead or dying in the streets. The remaining Japanese forces, their breakout attempt shattered, fragmented into small groups and attempted to escape individually through the bamboo groves and irrigation ditches surrounding San Manuel. Some succeeded, most didn't. Captain Hiroshi Shigemi was among those killed, though the exact circumstances of his death were never clearly recorded. His body was found 3 days later, killed by artillery shrapnel, still clutching his sword. The Battle of San Manuel cost the Americans significant casualties. 19 men killed on January 24th alone. Technical 4th grade Laverne Parish, a medic assigned to 1st Battalion, 161st Infantry, carried 5 wounded men to safety before he was fatally wounded by mortar fragments. He received a posthumous Medal of Honor, one of only 2 awarded for the battle. But Japanese casualties dwarfed American losses. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers killed. 45 tanks destroyed, 40 medium, 5 light, 15 artillery pieces captured or destroyed. The Shigemi detachment ceased to exist as a fighting force, and San Manuel was just one town. The systematic destruction of the 2nd Tank Division continued throughout February. At Lupao, at Muñoz, at Urdaneta. Everywhere the pattern repeated. Japanese tanks, dug into defensive positions, engaged American forces. American artillery pounded the positions. American infantry, supported by Shermans and tank destroyers, systematically reduced strongpoints. Japanese tankers, many of whom had survived battles in China and Manchuria, died in vehicles that had become coffins. By March 5, 1945, the butcher's bill for the 2nd Tank Division was final. 203 Type 97 Chi-Ha tanks destroyed. 19 Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks destroyed. 2 Type 4 Ho-Ro self-propelled guns destroyed. Out of 224 armoured fighting vehicles that began the campaign, only 2 remained operational. Those 2 were abandoned when their crews ran out of fuel and ammunition. The attack division Geki force had been annihilated. But we must ask, Why? Why was the disparity so catastrophic? Japanese tankers weren't cowards. The crews of those Chi-Ha tanks at San Manuel, who knew the breakout attempt was nearly suicidal but made it anyway, demonstrated courage that bordered on the superhuman. Japanese tank doctrine, developed through years of combat in China, wasn't inherently foolish. The decision to use armor in support of defensive strongpoints, while it negated mobility, was a rational response to American air superiority and artillery dominance. So why did 220 tanks, crewed by trained soldiers, supported by infantry and artillery, defending prepared positions, get obliterated by a force only one-third their size in armor? The answer lies in the numbers we discussed at the beginning. The technical specifications that seemed academic suddenly become viscerally real when we understand their implications. The Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha had 25mm of frontal armor. The Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate 86mm at 500 yards. This meant that at any range where the Chi-Ha could see the Sherman could destroy the Chi-Ha. But the reverse was not true. The 47mm gun on the Chi-Ha could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor 64mm on the hull, 76mm on the turret, only at very close range, typically under 300 yards, and only if it hit at the right angle. The Sherman's sloped armor meant that rounds striking at oblique angles had to penetrate much more metal than the nominal thickness suggested. A 64mm plate struck at 30 degrees from perpendicular had an effective thickness exceeding 90mm. This created a lethal geometry. American Shermans could engage Japanese tanks at ranges where the Japanese couldn't effectively shoot back. American tank commanders, trained in gunnery techniques developed fighting German armor in North Africa and Europe, knew how to position their vehicles for maximum armor effectiveness. Japanese tankers, whose doctrine emphasized close-range ambushes, rarely got the opportunity to execute that doctrine against an enemy with air superiority, artillery superiority, and the tactical patience to pound positions from a distance before closing in. But there's a deeper truth here, one that transcends ballistics and armor thickness. The Type 97 Chi-Ha wasn't a bad tank by the standards of 1938 when it entered service. Against Chinese nationalist forces, it performed excellently. Against lightly equipped British forces in Malaya, operating with surprise and aggressive tactics, it succeeded. The problem wasn't the tank itself. The problem was that Japanese industrial capacity couldn't keep pace with the war's demands. While American factories produced 50,000 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1945, Japanese factories produced fewer than 3,000 tanks of all types during the entire war. While American metallurgists developed improved armor alloys and American gunmakers developed higher velocity weapons, Japanese industry struggled to maintain production levels of existing designs. The Chi-Nu, the improved medium tank specifically designed to counter the Sherman, was developed by October of 1943, but only 166 were built before war's end, and not a single one saw combat. They were all held in reserve for the defense of the Japanese home islands. So the men of the 2nd Tank Division fought in 1945, with tanks designed in 1937, upgunned in 1941, but still fundamentally obsolete against the enemies they faced. They were brave men in outdated machines, sent to fight a defensive battle against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. The shock that Japanese tankers experienced the moment when armor-piercing rounds penetrated their supposedly protective steel wasn't just physical shock. It was psychological. It was the moment when propaganda met reality. When assurances from headquarters met the physics of high-velocity projectiles. When faith in Japanese fighting spirit met American industrial might. Warrant Officer Kojura Wada survived the war. After his tank was penetrated at Binalonan, he and his surviving crew members escaped on foot, eventually making their way north to join other scattered Japanese forces. He surrendered in August of 1945, after Japan's capitulation. In interviews conducted years later, he was asked about his experience in the Philippines campaign. What stayed with him most, he said, wasn't the fear during combat, it was the moment after his tank was hit. The moment when he realized that everything he'd been taught about Japanese armor superiority was wrong, that the technical specifications in the manuals were either outdated or deliberately optimistic, that he and his crew had been sent into battle in vehicles that were death traps against American firepower. "We were told we could win," Wada said. "We were told our tanks were adequate. We were told that courage and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. But when that Sherman fired, and the round went through our armor like it was made of paper, I understood. We had already lost, we just hadn't admitted it yet." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The story of Japanese tankers in the Philippines campaign is ultimately a story about the collision between belief and reality. About men who fought courageously in a war their nation could not win, with equipment their industry could not adequately produce. The 2nd Tank Division's destruction wasn't the result of cowardice or incompetence. It was the inevitable outcome when a military force optimized for colonial warfare against lesser-equipped opponents met the full weight of American combined arms doctrine, backed by the world's largest industrial economy. Those Japanese tankers who climbed into their Type 97 Chi-Ha tanks on the morning of January 17th, 1945, believed they were riding into battle in formidable weapons. By nightfall, those who survived understood the truth. They had been riding into battle in coffins. The only question had been when those coffins would be sealed. The largest tank battle of the Pacific War wasn't really a battle at all. It was an execution, one that took 6 weeks to complete and cost over 200 Japanese tanks and thousands of lives. American forces documented it meticulously in after-action reports, unit histories, and casualty lists. Those documents, preserved in archives, tell us exactly what happened, but they can't fully convey what it felt like. The moment of shock, the instant of realization, the split second when the armor failed and everything changed. That shock, that terrible understanding, was repeated 222 times across the killing fields of central Luzon. Each time an American 75mm or 76mm round penetrated Japanese armor. Each time a crew realized, too late, that their training had been based on lies. Each time courage and fighting spirit proved insufficient against metal moving at 2,600 feet per second. The Japanese tankers were shocked, not because American technology was secretly superior, but because Japanese propaganda had assured them it wasn't. Not because their own equipment was poorly designed for its original purpose, but because that purpose, defeating Chinese nationalist forces in 1938, bore no relationship to the reality of fighting American armor in 1945. They were shocked because they had been betrayed. Not by their officers, who were equally deceived, not by their crews, who fought with extraordinary bravery, but by a military-industrial system that sent them to war in obsolete equipment and told them it was adequate. That is the real story of the Type 97 Chi-Ha in the Philippines. Not a story of Japanese failure, but a story of Japanese tragedy, the tragedy of brave men fighting with inadequate tools, dying for a cause already lost. Their shock, in those final moments when American rounds penetrated their armor, was the shock of betrayal. And that shock echoed across 222 burning tanks, across the rice paddies of Luzon, across the entire doomed enterprise of Japan's war in the Pacific. They had been told they could win. They discovered, too late, that they never had a chance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.